I'm going to show you how one thing leads to another and how everything else is interconnected. Just in my study, not cosmically. But recently I have been going into the American Monthly Magazine. I purchased a copy of the second volume, and in that is a bunch of Abby Poyen's poetry written when she was 14 in a class conducted by Albert Pike. And I've demonstrated that Albert Pike stole it, probably right out of her workbook, and published it and claimed it as his own and reworked it and various things. So that led me back into the Philadelphia album of 1831, where quite a number of Abby's poems also appear, and there's a question as to who actually submitted them. But anyway, while I was in there, I found two asterisk or star signed essays. And at the time, I just said, well, that's interesting. Mathew apparently contributed a couple pieces to that paper. And then I had the nagging feeling, maybe Abby was prompting me. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes. But I had the nagging feeling, no, you need to go back and do due diligence and not be lazy and see what else might be in there. So I went in there, and there's a whole series. There are 18 of Mathew's. I've determined it is Mathew's work. 18 of these star sign pieces in there. So then I found that they all are in the section where the editor would typically write his editorials. It's some people call it the masthead. I think in England there's a different way of using that term, masthead, but it's not the front page with the big ribbon on the top. It's like the second or third page, and then there's the name of the periodical and the date of that edition, and then underneath that, typically the editor will put his editorials. So all of these star-signed essays and editorials really appear in that section, but there are also some that are not signed. So it appears that there are two editors writing there. But during this time, Mathew was editing the New York Constellation during the whole period. We're talking from the end of July to the beginning of November 1831. So he can't have been editing both papers. But here's the thing, he was also pursuing a mercantile career. He was involved in working for or even partnering in a trading company in New York City. And what I've figured out is that he would have been traveling back and forth during these few months for that trading company from New York to Philadelphia. So he probably spent about as much time in Philadelphia as he did in New York, and he still managed to edit the Constellation somehow or other. But in the meantime, he would have had plenty of time to write 2 or 3 pieces, say, each week for the Philadelphia album. And he typically would introduce himself to editors, visit the newspaper office and introduce himself and so on. He liked to do that. We got lots of evidence of that. So he would have introduced himself to this editor to whom he'd been submitting Abby's poetry possibly and some of his other things. And the editor said, look, tell you what, you're welcome to have a column in the editorial section of the paper. You can write 2 or 3 little essays for our editorial section, and we'll go ahead and give you a signature. And Mathew had been using the star, once or twice before. So he said, well, I'll go ahead and use a star because that's something significant to my young tutor. And she was beginning to be kind of his romantic interest at that point, but she was a little young yet in 1831. But anyway, he would have used the star because it was something that Abby loved and thought was particularly significant. So he went ahead and did that. And so now the gauntlet was thrown, and I had to get in there and see, are these all consistent from Mathew Franklin Whittier's authorship, and what might it reveal? Well, first of all, this is significant because of the date. This is 1831. That's earlier than the earliest example of Mathew using the star regularly for reviews and things of that nature. That was in the Essayist in 1832. Here we are in 1831, and we've got 18 examples. And that, if you haven't been following this blog or my work, is significant because I've determined it was really Mathew Franklin Whittier who was writing the star-signed reviews and essays in 1844 through 1846 for the New York Tribune, which body of work has been assumed by scholars to have been written by Margaret Fuller, the great transcendentalist Margaret Fuller. It wasn't Margaret Fuller, it was Mathew Franklin Whittier, either freelancing for the paper or ghostwriting specifically for Fuller. It's not clear what that relationship was, as I've said, but at any rate, all of that material, with one or two possible exceptions, was all Mathew. So now we have him doing exactly the same thing in the Philadelphia album, and we're talking 14 years earlier, 15 years earlier. So we now have a precedent for Mathew having been the asterisk, the star in the Tribune. The evidence is very strong. Problem is I can't get anybody to take me seriously long enough to look at it, but the evidence is really, really strong. Well, anyway, so let's look at these. There's a couple pretty strong implications that come out of this. One of them is that we now have some pretty strong evidence that Mathew was using the star for these same purposes. And these essays sound exactly like the person writing in the Tribune. I mean, it's exactly the same style. And I won't try to compare those. So here is my copy of the Philadelphia album. I have put a cover on it. The back cover is original, but I had to put a wraparound front cover. It's not attached. It's just sort of sitting on top. And let's get into this a little bit. First off, I want to show you my spreadsheet of asterisks, because I have made a spreadsheet of all of the pieces that Mathew signed with an asterisk by newspaper, which is roughly by era. So I'm going to put that up on the screen. Here we have the publication on the left. This is alphabetized, and the genre, the date of the publication, and then it goes down. That's the Carpetbag, the Boston Chronotype, which was in the 1840s. Weekly Museum is 51 to 53. New England Magazine goes back to 1831 and 1832. This is a little bit after. This is like the month. This one here is the month after the last of the star-signed editorials that appears in the Philadelphia album. I may be boring people, I don't know. Here's the New York Tribune. That's all of the work that was incorrectly attributed to Margaret Fuller. We're talking 238 pieces. And now here we hit the Philadelphia album in 1831. You can see the last of the Tribune was 46. Here is 1831. And there's all of these pieces in the Philadelphia album. And then we go down to the Portland Transcript, and there's a whole bunch of star-signed pieces in the Transcript as well. Here's the essayist back in 32. You can see that. There's a typo there. The Odd Fellow, Mathew was an Odd Fellow, which is like the Masons. There's a bunch in there, and so on. But then we have my expression search term. Well, I haven't gone through all of these, but I did put in a couple of Mathew's typical phrases that he used in the Philadelphia album in 1831 here. So he liked to use the word nasal, or a couple times nasal, and proboscis. So I put those in to check them out. And the reason he would do this is that he was very sensitive about his long pointed nose. And by the way, when I was into his quail series, I found that he actually referred to that. He made a pun about pointed and nose, and he was identifying himself. There was a question as to whether somebody else that wrote for the paper, the Weekly Museum, was going to imitate him and write their own traveling, on-the-wing travelogue. And so he identified himself. He made a pun of nose and pointed, there. So he, there's no question but that Mathew was quails in the Weekly Museum. But here we have nasal or nasal, which shows up in the Philadelphia album. There's 38 instances, okay? And we're talking early, the New England Galaxy is like the late 1820s. There's a couple examples there. In the New England Magazine in 1831, there's one. In the Philadelphia album, there's the one that I found. In the New York Constellation that he was editing at the same time, there's 12 references to nasal. The Portland Transcript, there's 5. In the Daily Delta, where he wrote as F the first of 3 years, 1846, when he left the Tribune and took a job undercover as an anti-slavery operative and writing as a reporter for the Daily Delta in New Orleans. There's one there. So you see how this works. Now, there's also some instances that show up in George Burnham and Francis Durabage's works that they stole from Mathew. There's 3 in the pieces they published in the Flag of Our Union. And then you come over to their compilations, and there's 1 in their compilations. So there's 5 that were in the work stolen by Francis Durivage and George Burnham, and 33 of Matthew's. See? So that's nasal. Then we get down to proboscis, and we see there's 17 times that Matthew used the word proboscis. So early in the New England Galaxy in the 1820s, there's one in the Philadelphia album, one in the Constellation that he was editing, and so on. So we come over here and we find that Durivage and Burnham stole pieces that had the word proboscis twice, and 15 of them were Matthew. So that's how that works. Now I could show you how I determine that all of this is Matthew's work, but there's two things in particular that I want to show you. One of them is that among these 18 editorials signed with a star, there are two that are pro-women, or what you might call feminist. And this is important because scholars, when they look at this body of work that they mistakenly attribute to Margaret Fuller, they know that she was a feminist, and they see this kind of feminist trend in the writing, this pro-women trend in the writing, and they apparently feel very secure in saying, oh, that has to be Margaret Fuller, because look at all this pro-women writing in here. Well, that was Matthew, and I can prove that he did that because there are two pieces like that here in the Philadelphia album. There is one here called Female Education. I've skipped the other one, but we'll go back. Female Education in the September 10, 1851 edition. I'm going to pull my light down here. And he writes, could we grave it with a point of steel in deep wounds upon every neglecting parent's heart? Could we write it upon the walls of every parlor in letters of living fire? Could we teach the playful lightning to chase in form of letters along the black thundercloud, we would have it written in terms so palpable that none could shut it from their view. Educate your daughters. And he goes on like that about the importance of educating young women. And the problem was that in that day in America, even families with the means to educate their daughters were educating them by way of preparing them for marriage. They were learning how to sew, they were learning how to cook, they were learning how to draw, how to play piano, how to sing, all of these wifely things, but they weren't being given a real education. Now in Europe, it was a different story. They were given a full education there. Abby's father was a marquis, was a wealthy, relatively wealthy upper class family. She was given a full tutored European education, and she passed that along to Matthew. She was his tutor, even though she was 4 years younger. I've determined this from a whole bunch of clues. And therefore, Matthew had Abby in front of him as a shining example of what young women could be. It happens that she was exceptionally brilliant, but nonetheless, he had in front of him this example of his young tutor, and that's why he's writing in that vein. But it's not really the feminist perspective, because if you read it closely, you see what he's saying is you should educate your daughters so that they will be good influences for their sons, and that will impact society. See, so this is not really a woman writing, and it's the same way in the Tribune, in the material that they think was written by Margaret Fuller. It's not written by a woman, it's written by a liberal man, and you can tell if you get in there and look at it. Now let's see if I can find the other one, because that's just one of two. In the June 30, 1831, I don't dare hold this up. It's really quite fragile. The spine is coming apart, and I really don't know how to repair it. This is called American Ladies. We anticipate yet to see the day when the counsel of our ladies will be as much sought after and esteemed as highly as ever was the advice of females in the days should be of Greece or Rome. Now, you can extrapolate a couple things out of this. First off, Abby was teaching him about the history of ancient Greece and Rome. That was part of her classical education that she was giving him. And secondly, she was his tutor, and he was taking her advice, see? Unfortunately, I think in later years when they were married, he didn't take her advice on crucial matters of business and partnership as much as he should have. But nonetheless, in 1831 here, when she was tutoring him, this is the tone that he's taking. So if you take these two together and the fact that they are written over the star signature, it becomes much more plausible that Mathew Franklin Whittier could in fact have been the author of those star-signed pro-women reviews and essays in the New York Tribune in 1844 through 1846. So that's the first thing I derived out of this. The second was the very last article. Now, this is the Philadelphia album and Ladies' Portfolio. That's the full name of it in 1831. They changed it, I think, from a Gazette in 1830. And in the very last one, he writes a kind of a whimsical little piece on ladies' albums. And I think it was, intentional, that he was writing about ladies' albums to the ladies in the album. But an album was one of these. This is an album. And it was, the way that the kids will sign in their friends' yearbooks. So this was kind of like a yearbook that they would sign. And typically they would write poetry in it. And it's amazing. The poetry that's in here, some is original, some is not. Typically they would quote who they were writing, who they were copying if they copied from somebody. The handwriting was exquisite. And I'll show you an example that blew me away. The type is so small that you can't even read it visually. You need a magnifying glass to read this. And whether it's any good or not, I don't know. I'm going to put it up on the screen. I should have copied it over myself to be able to read it for you, but here it is in the book itself. You can get a sense of just how small and how meticulous the handwriting is. It's unbelievable. So no, I don't even think I can read it here. I've read it once and I kind of got the gist of it, but it's pretty tough. A moment more, and he had reached his home when, that's about as much as I think you can read it better because I'm going to put it up on the screen. Anyway, it so happens, and the reason I bought this is that Mathew contributed to this album. This was in Bradford, Massachusetts, which I believe is across the river from his native Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's May of 1851. In a couple months, he would head out to Europe writing as quails for the Boston Weekly Museum. That was not Ossian Dodge. I can prove that 100%. That was Mathew Franklin Whittier. The authorship was appropriated by Dodge in a conspiracy with the editor, Charles A.V. Putnam, a real conspiracy. So Mathew apparently was visiting home before his trip to Europe, because in those days, you weren't 100% sure you were going to make it back. And he almost didn't, because he got very, very sick on the trip back, to where he mentions that the doctor thought he was going to lose him. But anyway, he visits home, and while he's there, apparently he visits with an old classmate, because it's signed, affectionately, your classmate, M.F. Whittier. So he visits with one of his old classmates. For anybody who's into John Greenleaf Whittier, that means that whoever owned this album was one of the classmates in the little one-room schoolhouse that John Greenleaf Whittier attended. I'm guessing it was a Kimball. The Kimbells were a big family. There's still Kimball Farm down there in East Haverhill, and I'm guessing that this was one of the Kimbells, a lady, because I think it was girls primarily that had these albums. So anyway, Mathew has put in here some lines from a poem called The Beautiful, and this poem is magnificent. In my opinion, it is better than The Raven. I mean, it's of equal quality, but spiritually, he's expressing his faith and his mysticism that Abbey had taught him, and it is magnificent. I think that Mathew would have written this in 1839. There's a poem in a very, very similar meter I think it's signed F, that's by Mathew in the Portland transcript. That was a period when Abbey was helping him, just the way that Mathew's little sister, Elizabeth, used to help John Greenleaf Whittier, give him feedback and so on. I think Abbey did the same thing for Mathew. It's really a magnificent poem. I've read it before. I won't do that again. But that poem first shows up in print in this volume. This is a compilation, an annual compilation called The Rose of Sharon. This is the 1842 edition. And the very, very last poem in here is The Beautiful, and it is attributed to Edwin H. Chapin. Well, Edwin H. Chapin is a minister. I think he was a Southern minister who kind of became radicalized and against slavery. And he visited Boston, I believe it was, in 1839, or Portland. No, I think he visited Portland in 1839 because there was a convention there. And Mathew and Abby could have met with him, very likely did meet with him, possibly shared some of their poetry with him, because a poem that I think was Abby's shows up in the earlier edition, also toward the back of 1841. I think that was Abby's poem. This one was Mathew's. So they must have shared some poetry with him. Now, how it ended up under his name in the Rose of Sharon, we don't know. I'm not prepared to accuse Edwin H. Chapin of plagiarism. I would guess that he shared it with somebody else. That other person assumed that Chapin had actually written it. He wasn't really that good a poet, near as I can tell. He wasn't known really as a poet. And what he did is he collaborated with somebody else and he published some hymns, which really don't sound like this. They're not, first off, this is mystical, and I know the difference. And his poetry is more traditional Christian, about the wonderful fact that God has brought the congregation together and things like that, what you'd expect from a traditional minister. But this is clearly mysticism, as above, so below, kind of mysticism. So, but now we have this clue, see, this is what I wanted to get to, because before I had all that conjecture. And I'm going to put up on the screen what it looks like in the album. And what you'll see is that Mathew has not attributed it to E.H. Chapin. This is 1851 now, 9 years after it first appeared in Rose of Sharon. So he would have known about the attribution. He did not attribute it. And typically Mathew would do that. He certainly would never have plagiarized anybody else's work. And then his signature is, after your classmate, underneath that M.F. Whittier, he's kind of sort of come close to signing that poem himself. So the question is, what would he typically have done? What did he believe in? Well, this little essay about ladies' albums, and I love the writing style on this, but basically what he's done is to say to the ladies, when you let some people copy over famous poets like Byron and Milton and Shakespeare, which were the ones that Mathew liked, certainly Byron and Shakespeare. If you let people copy over the best of Shakespeare, the best of Milton and Byron, and then you ask some poor guy to write something original, it's very daunting because, there's all of this magnificent poetry of the best through the ages, and then you've got to write something and it's going to look awful. So Mathew suggests, why not make everybody write something original? And he says, even some of it will be funny, but that's okay, give you something to laugh about, But you might get a ringer, basically, he says in his own language. You might get somebody that really writes exceptionally well, meaning, of course, himself. See? So from that, we know that Mathew, first of all, was very much aware of this business of attribution, that he never would have put in Edward Chapin's poem without signing it, Edward Chapin, see, without attributing it, but also that he believed in writing original poetry in albums. We have it here in black and white that as of 1831, that was his strong preference. So that lends a lot more weight to the idea that Mathew would have put an original poem in here and not copied over Edwin Chapin and not attributed it. See, so now we've got a pretty strong idea that aside from the other clues like style and so on and mysticism, which Chapin wasn't a mystic and this was, we have another strong clue that this was actually Mathew Franklin Whittier's poem, The Beautiful. And that is important because of how good it is. It's weird to brag on your own past life work, and poetry is subjective and 20 people will have 20 different opinions. But I'm telling you, this is magnificent mystical poetry, better than a raven, I would say, and people of the future will pick up on that. I'm not just, because in order for what I'm saying to be plausible, Mathew has to have been a literary genius. He can't have been a pedestrian writer, because the likes of Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe and Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Barrett Browning could not possibly have reached the heights of fame by stealing a mediocre writer's poetry and prose. See, it's not possible. But if they had stolen the work of a literary genius who was so reclusive that he wouldn't come out and identify himself as the author. Even when the people that stole or borrowed or used his work got famous themselves, then you have the perfect storm. Then what I'm saying is entirely plausible, see? So I've rambled on enough. That's 30 minutes worth of rambling just to make a couple of points that I have stumbled upon a very large source of Mathew Franklin Whittier's early star-signed reviews and essays and editorials written in precisely the same style as what you'll find in the New York Tribune in 1844 through 1846, which was mistakenly attributed to Margaret Fuller, making it far more plausible that Mathew was, in fact, the author of that series, as I say he was, just more evidence on top of evidence, And then the second thing is that it's now extremely plausible that Mathew was the author of the poem The Beautiful, which was somehow attributed to E.H. Chapin, and that he wrote it in this album because it was his, and didn't attribute it to E.H. Chapin because it wasn't Chapin's. So there you have it. I know I'm doing a lot of these entries. Basically, I'll do an entry when I discover something, and it just so happened there was a flurry of discoveries. So far as I know, the next one is going to be to deal with the Christmas Carol when we get a little bit further into the Christmas season. I am going to read a story called The New Year's Bells, which Mathew wrote around 1830, which is absolutely not just a precursor, but practically a template. It's really the template that Mathew and Abby would have used to start with when they began writing the original of A Christmas Carol in late 1838, wrapping it up during the same period that Mathew wrote the poem The Beautiful in 1839 when they moved to Portland. So I'm going to read that entire story. And the other thing I'm going to do in a separate entry is to sit down like I did with The Raven. I'm going to sit down and explain from beginning to end, just off the top of my head, how A Christmas Carol came to be associated with Charles Dickens and why it was not actually his work.